There is a silent habit many people carry without ever questioning it, the habit of leaving themselves behind. It doesn't happen all at once. It begins subtly, almost invisibly, in moments where you choose to stay quiet instead of speaking your truth, where you say, yes, while something deep inside you resists, where you prioritize harmony over honesty. At first, it feels like the right thing to do. It feels mature, selfless, even necessary. But over time, this pattern begins to shape your entire inner world in ways you don't immediately recognize. Self-abandonment is not loud or dramatic. It doesn't announce itself as a problem. Instead, it disguises itself as responsibility, kindness, and adaptability. You become the person others can rely on, the one who understands, the one who adjusts. But beneath that identity, something begins to erode. Each time you ignore your own needs, you send yourself a quiet message. What I feel does not matter as much as what others need. That message, repeated over time, becomes a belief, and that belief begins to define your emotional reality. The cost of this is not immediate, which is why it is so dangerous. You don't notice it in a single moment, you feel it in accumulation. It shows up as a constant sense of fatigue that rest does not fix. It appears as irritation that seems to come from nowhere. It lives in the quiet resentment you feel toward people you care about, even when they have done nothing explicitly wrong. These emotions are not random, they are signals. They are the consequence of a life where your inner voice has been consistently ignored. As self-abandonment deepens, you begin to lose clarity about who you really are. Your decisions become shaped by expectations rather than authenticity. You start asking, what do they want? Instead of what do I feel? Over time, this creates a disconnection between your external life and your internal truth. You may appear composed, successful, or dependable on the outside, but internally there is confusion. A sense that something is missing, even if everything seems fine. One of the most profound costs is the loss of emotional safety within yourself. When you repeatedly dismiss your own feelings, you create an environment where your emotions are not welcomed. You become someone who invalidates their own experience. This makes it difficult to trust yourself. You second guess your instincts. You question your reactions. You hesitate to set boundaries because you are no longer sure if your needs are valid. Relationships also begin to reflect this pattern. When you abandon yourself, you unconsciously teach others how to treat you. Not through what you say, but through what you allow. If you consistently overlook your own limits, others may do the same, not always out of malice, but because the boundaries were never clearly defined. This leads to a cycle where you feel unseen or unappreciated, yet struggle to express why. There is also a deeper psychological cost, the fragmentation of the self. When your actions repeatedly contradict your inner truth, a divide is created. One part of you continues to adapt, perform, and meet expectations while another part quietly withdraws. This inner split creates tension. It is the source of that feeling of being out of alignment, of living a life that does not fully feel like your own. Over time, this disconnection can lead to emotional numbness. When feelings are consistently ignored, the mind begins to suppress them altogether as a form of protection. You may find it harder to experience joy, excitement, or even sadness. Life begins to feel flat, not because nothing is happening, but because your connection to your own emotional world has weakened. And yet, despite all of this, self-abandonment often continues because it feels familiar. It becomes a pattern that is difficult to break, not because it is fulfilling, but because it is known. Choosing yourself, in contrast, feels uncertain. It requires confronting guilt, fear, and the possibility of change. But what remains undeniable is that every moment of self-abandonment carries a cost that accumulates over time, shaping not only how you feel, but who you become. There is a part of you that keeps track of everything you ignore. It watches quietly when you dismiss your own feelings. It records the moments you tell yourself, "It's not a big deal," when something inside you clearly says otherwise. It notices when you avoid your own pain, distract yourself from discomfort, or push aside emotions that feel inconvenient or overwhelming. This part of you does not argue, does not interrupt, and does not force itself into your awareness. It waits. This is the shadow formed through neglect, not something dark or evil, but something unseen, unacknowledged, and deeply alive within you. Neglect does not erase experience. It buries it. Every emotion you refuse to feel does not disappear. It changes form. It moves beneath the surface into the unconscious, where it begins to shape your reactions in ways you don't immediately understand. What you suppress internally does not stay silent forever. It finds expression indirectly. This is why you may feel sudden waves of irritation that seem disproportionate to the situation. Why certain people trigger you without clear reason. Why patterns repeat in your relationships even when you consciously want something different. The shadow is not random. It is organized around everything you have chosen not to face. The more you neglect parts of yourself, the more influence they gain. At first, this influence is subtle. A slight tension in your body, a feeling of unease you cannot explain, a thought you quickly dismiss. But over time, as neglect continues, the shadow becomes more persistent. It demands attention, not through clarity, but through disruption. Anxiety often emerges from what is unprocessed. It is the mind's way of signaling that something unresolved is seeking acknowledgement. Emotional overwhelm can come from the accumulation of feelings that were never given space. Even numbness, the absence of feeling, is not emptiness. It is the result of too much being pushed away for too long. There is a paradox at the center of neglect. The more you try to avoid discomfort, the more it defines your inner world. Avoidance feels like control in the moment. You tell yourself that ignoring something will make it easier, that staying busy or distracted will help you move on. But what you are actually doing is delaying the encounter. The emotion remains unchanged, waiting for the moment it can resurface, or often stronger, often less manageable. This is how the shadow grows. It is built from the pieces of yourself you did not allow to exist openly. The anger you thought was unacceptable. The sadness you believed was weakness. The fear you tried to hide. Over time, these parts do not disappear. They gather, forming a hidden layer of your psyche that influences your behavior from behind the scenes. One of the most significant effects of this shadow is projection. When something within you remains unacknowledged, you begin to see it in others. Traits, emotions, or behaviors you reject internally become the very things that frustrate or disturb you externally. It feels as though the problem is outside of you, but in many cases it is a reflection of something unresolved within. This creates confusion. You may find yourself reacting strongly to situations that seem minor or feeling disconnected from your own responses. You might say, "I don't know why I feel this way," not realizing that the answer exists in what has been consistently ignored. The shadow also affects your sense of identity. When parts of you are suppressed, your understanding of yourself becomes incomplete. You begin to define yourself only by what is acceptable, presentable, or comfortable, while the rest remains hidden. This creates an internal imbalance, a version of yourself that feels controlled on the surface, but unsettled underneath. Facing the shadow requires a shift in how you relate to your inner world. It means recognizing that nothing within you is inherently wrong or unworthy of attention. Every emotion, even the uncomfortable ones, carries information. They are not obstacles to avoid, but signals to understand. When you begin to acknowledge what you have neglected, something changes. The intensity of those hidden parts starts to soften. What once felt overwhelming becomes clearer. The shadow does not disappear, but it becomes integrated, no longer something that controls you from the outside, but something you understand from within. And in that process, what once lived in darkness begins to lose its power over you. There comes a point in life when distractions stop working. You try to stay busy, surround yourself with noise, chase goals, maintain routines, anything to keep moving forward. From the outside, it may look like progress. But internally, something feels unsettled. A quiet tension follows you, a sense that no matter how much you do, something essential remains unresolved. This is the moment where a different kind of courage is required, not the courage to act, achieve, or prove, but the courage to stop and look within. Turning inward is not a natural instinct for most people. The external world offers constant stimulation, validation, and direction. It tells you who to be, what to want, and how to measure your worth. It is far easier to follow these signals than to question them. Looking inward, by contrast, offers no immediate answers. It asks you to sit with uncertainty, to face emotions without distraction, and to encounter parts of yourself that you may have spent years avoiding. This is why it takes courage. Because when you turn inward, you are no longer able to escape yourself. You begin to notice the thoughts that repeat beneath the surface, the feelings that arise without clear cause, the contradictions between what you say you want and how you actually live. These realizations can be uncomfortable. They challenge the identity you have built and the narratives you have relied on. One of the first things you encounter when you look within is silence, not the peaceful kind, but the kind that reveals how much you have been avoiding. In that silence, emotions that were once suppressed begin to surface. Sadness, fear, anger, confusion. These are not signs that something is wrong. They are signs that something has been waiting to be acknowledged. The instinct is often to retreat, to return to distraction, to fill the space again, to regain a sense of control. But real transformation does not happen in avoidance. It happens in presence. It requires you to stay with what arises even when it feels unfamiliar or difficult to understand. Turning inward also means questioning the roles you have adopted. The version of yourself that others know may not fully reflect who you are. You may have learned to be agreeable, strong, independent, or accommodating, not because these traits are false, but because they became necessary at some point. Over time, they solidified into identity. Looking within asks you to examine these roles, to ask whether they still serve you, or whether they have become limitations. There is also a confrontation with truth. Not the truth that is convenient or comfortable, but the kind that disrupts your assumptions. You may realize that certain choices were not aligned with your values. that some relationships were maintained out of habit rather than connection. That parts of your life were built on expectations rather than authenticity. These realizations can create a sense of instability, as if the ground beneath you is shifting. But this instability is not destruction, it is clarity. Without turning inward, these patterns remain invisible. You continue to repeat behaviors without understanding why. You search for solutions externally, unaware that the source of your dissatisfaction lies within your own unexamined thoughts and emotions. Looking inward brings these patterns into awareness, making change possible. Another aspect of this courage is learning to trust what you find. Your inner world does not always speak in clear language. It communicates through feelings, instincts, and subtle shifts in awareness. Developing a relationship with this inner voice takes time. It requires patience, attention, and a willingness to listen without immediate judgment. As you continue this process, something begins to shift. The discomfort that once felt overwhelming becomes more familiar. The emotions that seemed chaotic start to make sense. You begin to recognize patterns, understand triggers, and see connections between your past experiences and present reactions. This awareness does not solve everything instantly, but it creates a foundation for change. Turning inward is not about isolating yourself from the world. It is about understanding yourself within it. It allows you to engage with life more consciously, to make decisions that reflect your true needs rather than unconscious patterns. It gives you the ability to respond rather than react, to choose rather than repeat. And while the path inward may feel uncertain, what it reveals is not something foreign, but something that has always been there, waiting to be seen, understood, and acknowledged. There is a subtle shift that happens when you begin to realize how much of your life has been shaped by voices that are not your own. These voices do not always come from others directly. Many of them have been internalized over time: expectations from family, standards from society, opinions from past experiences. They form a quiet framework that guides your decisions, often without your awareness. You begin to measure yourself against invisible rules, seeking approval, avoiding disapproval, and adjusting your behavior to fit what feels acceptable. At first, this can create a sense of direction. You follow what seems right, what has been reinforced, what keeps things stable. But over time, something begins to feel misaligned. You may achieve goals, maintain relationships, or fulfill responsibilities, yet still feel disconnected. This disconnection is not a lack of success. It is the absence of inner authority. Inner authority is the ability to trust your own perception, to make decisions based on your internal truth rather than external validation. When it is absent, you rely heavily on feedback from the outside. You look for reassurance before acting. You hesitate to make choices without confirmation. You question your instincts even when they are clear. The loss of this authority does not happen suddenly. It develops gradually through repeated moments of self-doubt. Each time you override your own feeling in favor of someone else's opinion, you weaken your trust in yourself. Each time you silence your perspective to avoid conflict or rejection, you reinforce the idea that your voice is less important. Over time, this creates a dependency on external guidance. Reclaiming inner authority begins with awareness. You start to notice how often you seek permission, sometimes explicitly, sometimes subtly. It may appear in small decisions like second, guessing what you want, or in larger ones, like delaying action until you receive approval. This awareness is not about judgment, it is about recognition. You begin to see the pattern clearly. With that recognition comes discomfort. Letting go of external validation can feel destabilizing. It removes a familiar structure, leaving you with uncertainty. You may question whether you are making the right choices. You may worry about how others will respond when you no longer conform in the same way. This phase can feel like standing without support, even though what you are actually doing is learning to support yourself. A key part of this process is rebuilding trust in your own perception. This does not mean assuming you are always correct, but rather acknowledging that your experience is valid. Your thoughts, feelings, and reactions are information. They reflect your values, your boundaries, and your needs. When you begin to listen to them without immediately dismissing or correcting them, you create space for self-understanding. Reclaiming inner authority also involves making decisions without excessive external input. This can start with small choices. Instead of asking what others think, you pause and ask yourself what feels aligned. You allow yourself to sit with that answer, even if it feels unfamiliar. Acting on your own judgment reinforces the connection between your inner voice and your external actions. There is also a shift in how you relate to mistakes. When your sense of authority comes from within, errors are no longer seen as proof of inadequacy, but as part of the learning process. You begin to take responsibility for your choices without using them as a measure of your worth. This reduces the fear of getting things wrong, which often drives the need for external validation. Boundaries become clear as well. When you trust your own perspective, you are more likely to recognize when something does not feel right. You do not need extensive justification to set a limit. The feeling itself is enough. This changes the way you interact with others. You are no longer adjusting yourself to maintain approval, but expressing yourself in a way that reflects your internal state. As this process continues, a sense of stability begins to form. Not the kind that depends on consistency from the outside, but one that comes from within. You become less reactive to opinions, less influenced by shifting expectations, and more grounded in your own understanding. Decisions become more direct, actions more intentional. Reclaiming inner authority is not about rejecting all external input. It is about changing the relationship you have with it. You can still listen, consider, and learn from others, but their perspectives no longer override your own. They become part of the process, not the source of your direction. And in that shift, you move from a life guided by approval to a life guided by awareness. There is a difference between living a life that looks complete and living a life that feels whole. From the outside, everything can appear in place, responsibilities managed, relationships maintained, goals pursued. Yet internally, there can be a quiet sense of fragmentation, as if different parts of you are moving in different directions. This feeling does not come from a lack of effort, it comes from a lack of alignment. And at the center of that misalignment is often one pattern, the consistent choice to place yourself last. Self-priority is frequently misunderstood. It is associated with selfishness, with neglecting others, with creating distance in relationships. Because of this, many people resist it, believing that their value comes from how much they give, how much they accommodate, how much they sacrifice. But what is often overlooked is that constant self-sacrifice does not create wholeness, it creates division. Each time you override your own needs to meet external demands, a split occurs. One part of you continues to function, to perform, to meet expectations. Another part begins to withdraw, carrying the unmet needs, the unspoken thoughts, the ignored emotions. Over time, this division grows. You may not notice it immediately, but it reveals itself in subtle ways: a lack of energy, a sense of disconnection, a feeling that something within you is not fully present. Wholeness is not about adding more to your life. It is about bringing all parts of yourself into alignment. This cannot happen if some parts are consistently ignored. Prioritizing yourself does not mean rejecting responsibility or withdrawing from others. It means recognizing that your internal state is not separate from how you live. It is the foundation of it. When your needs, values, and emotions are acknowledged, your actions begin to reflect who you truly are rather than who you feel you need to be. At first, this shift can feel unfamiliar. You may not even be sure what prioritizing yourself looks like. When you have spent a long time focusing outward, turning inward requires a different kind of attention. It begins with noticing, recognizing when something feels off, when your energy is depleted, when your responses feel forced. These are not inconveniences to push aside. They are signals pointing to areas where alignment is missing. Responding to these signals is where self-priority takes form. It may involve setting limits where you previously overextended. It may require saying no when you would have said yes. It may mean choosing rest over productivity, honesty over agreement, distance over obligation. These choices are not always comfortable, especially when they disrupt established patterns, but they are necessary for integration. As you begin to act in alignment with your internal experience, something starts to change. The division within you begins to close. The part of you that was previously ignored starts to re-engage. You feel more present in your own life, not because everything is perfect, but because you are no longer operating against yourself. There is also a shift in how you experience relationships. When you prioritize yourself, your interactions become more authentic. You are not engaging from a place of obligation or expectation, but from a place of choice. This changes the quality of connection. It allows for clarity, for mutual respect, for a more balanced exchange. You are no longer giving at the expense of yourself, but from a place that is sustainable. Self-priority also affects your sense of identity. When your actions consistently reflect your internal state, you develop a clear understanding of who you are. There is less confusion, less contradiction. You are not constantly adjusting to fit different situations. You carry a consistent sense of self across them. This consistency creates stability, not in your circumstances, but in your experience of them. Over time, this alignment leads to a deeper sense of ease. Decisions become less complicated because they are guided by clarity rather than conflict. Emotional responses become more coherent because they are acknowledged rather than suppressed. You begin to trust yourself not as an abstract idea, but through repeated experience of acting in accordance with your own understanding. Wholeness is not something that arrives suddenly. It develops gradually through consistent attention to your internal world and the willingness to reflect it in your external choices. It is the result of choosing yourself not once, but repeatedly in ways both small and significant. And as that choice becomes integrated into how you live, the sense of fragmentation that once defined your experience begins to dissolve into something more unified, more stable, and more real.